In 1952, a railway inspector in Montana filed a report describing a locomotive that had been sitting on a siding for 3 weeks without refueling. The engine was still warm. The boiler pressure was holding steady. But there was no coal in the tender, no oil in the reservoir, no external power source. The report was forwarded to the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was never answered, and 6 months later, the locomotive was removed from service and scrapped. Not retired, scrapped. Why would a functional engine be destroyed instead of studied? The standard explanation is simple. The inspector made an error. He misread the fuel gauge or the service logs. Locomotives require fuel. That's basic thermodynamics. But the problem is that this wasn't an isolated report. Between 1948 and 1955, at least 24 similar incidents appear in regional rail archives. Engines described as running without combustion or under residual charge. The phrase residual charge shows up again and again, but it's never defined. And none of the engines in question had electric systems capable of sustaining operation for more than a few hours. Look at the design. These weren't experimental models. They were standard freight haulers, built in the 1920s and 30s. Heavy, simple, no advanced electronics, no storage batteries large enough to move that kind of weight. The fireboxes were conventional. The boilers were steel. There was nothing in the engineering that suggested self-sufficiency. And yet service logs from switching yards in Wyoming, Nevada, and Idaho describe trains moving short distances with no fuel consumption recorded. Not low consumption. None. Once you start looking for it, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. A 1951 maintenance memo from a depot in Utah mentions a locomotive that continued operational function for 18 days following fuel exhaustion. 18 days. The memo suggests the engine was drawing on latent thermal retention. But no known material retains heat at operational temperatures for that long, especially not while doing work. The memo was stamped query unresolved and filed without follow-up. Then there are the logbooks. Standard practice required engineers to document fuel levels at the start and end of every run. In most cases, the numbers match expectations, but there are exceptions. Runs where fuel usage is listed as 0, or marked with a dash, or scratched out entirely. These aren't clerical errors. They're corrections. Someone went back through the logs and removed the data. Not all of it, just the entries that didn't fit. By 1953, something shifts in the administrative language. Internal railroad communications begin referring to certain locomotives as heritage units or legacy stock. That's unusual. Those terms usually apply to passenger cars or historic displays, not active freight engines. But the locomotives in question were still in service, still hauling cargo. The designation didn't match their function. It's as if someone wanted them categorized differently, separated from the standard fleet. Around the same time, a series of locomotives were pulled from active routes and reassigned to remote spurs, places with little traffic, no public access. Some were left there for years. When they were finally scrapped, the process was handled by private contractors, not the usual salvage yards. And the paperwork describing what was removed is incomplete. Weights don't match. Serial numbers are missing. In a few cases, the disposal records list components that shouldn't have existed on those models. There's also the photographic record. Images from the late 1940s show certain locomotives with unusual housing around the boiler assembly. Smooth metal shells that weren't part of the original design. They appear retrofitted. But retrofitted for what? By the mid-1950s, those same engines are photographed again. The housings are gone. So is any mention of them in updated technical documentation. It's as if they were never there, and then the programs stop. In 1956, the last reference to residual charge operation appears in a regional report from the Northern Pacific Railway. After that, the terminology vanishes. So do the anomalies. Fuel logs return to normal. Maintenance records become routine. It's not that the technology failed. It's that the conversation around it ended. Abruptly, completely. What kind of propulsion system operates without fuel consumption? And why would functioning examples be systematically removed from service during a period when rail companies were desperate for efficiency? These engines weren't outdated. They weren't unsafe. They were described in internal memos as economically advantageous. So why scrap them? You can still find the service records if you know where to look. They're in regional archives, misfiled, uncatalogued, mixed in with routine paperwork. But they're there, and they all point to the same narrow window, 1948 to 1956. Less than a decade, just long enough for someone to notice, just short enough to be forgotten. Some of the engineers who worked on these trains are still alive. A few have given interviews over the years. They don't use technical terms. They just say the engines ran different, that they were quieter, that the fireboxes stayed cool even under load. When asked how that was possible, they shrug. They say they were told not to ask questions. And when the engines were taken away, no explanation was given. So where did the technology go? Not into public patents. Those are searchable. Not into academic engineering. There's no research trail. It just stops. And what stops isn't the engines themselves. It's the documentation, the institutional memory, the willingness to talk about it. Maybe the question isn't how they worked. Maybe the question is why we stopped asking. If you've come across rail records or technical documents that don't align with the standard history, feel free to share them below. And if this kind of investigation interests you, consider subscribing. Some patterns only become visible when you're willing to look at what's been left out.